Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping you're all out there. Well, it's Tuesday morning. It's 10 o'clock. It must be another one of our webinars. This is the fourth one in our May series. I'm Steve Smedley, Associate Director at Acuity. I'd like to welcome Gavin Smart, CEO at CIH. He's kindly agreed to provide us with a helicopter view of the present and future as we sweep over the housing operating environment.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I think it's the second time that I've done an Acuity event. It's rather different from the last time when I was with you all in a room together, but I'm looking forward to doing it this way. I've got some slides that I'm going to share with you in a second. Just my own public service announcement before we go any further. I was just saying to Steve and Mark that I live in a large household with 7 other people, 2 dogs, a variety of animals. So if I do get interrupted, I will try seamlessly to usher dogs, children or other members of the household in and out of this room without stopping, but my apologies. Maybe I'll provide you with some So I'm just going to share now some slides with you, which I hope you will all be able to see. Here we go. So I've got some slides and some pictures to show you. I've slightly adjusted the title that I was given because I've turned it into a question, because I think anybody who tells you that they know for sure where we're going at the moment certainly has a degree of confidence that I don't possess. But I'm going to try to give you my take on where we are at the moment and how things are panning out. And oh, that's not a good start. My slides are frozen. Right, let's keep going. There we go. Right, so these are the things that I'm going to talk to you about. I'll do a little bit of kind of an economics overview, because I don't think we can talk about the world for housing at the moment without understanding the world for the economy and the world for the government finances. A little bit about the political environment that we're operating in, because I think that's going to determine a lot for what happens for housing for the next 18 months, 2 years. A touch on the housing market. And then my sense of where we might be with the policy environment. When Steve asked me to do this talk, I thought, yeah, that's okay. I can do that. That's kind of, state of the nation. Do that quite often. That should be relatively straightforward. I can tell you that it's a lot less straightforward now in the environment that we're currently in. But I'll do my best to give you my sense of where I think we are, what might be happening, and whether or not we can draw any conclusions at all from the things that are going on. Before I begin, here's the obligatory advertising slide. Just a reminder for those of you who don't know us, CIH, Chartered Institute of Housing, is the professional body for people who work in housing. We exist to do 3 things, really: to support our members, to train, educate and qualify the housing profession, and to be the public voice of housing. I'm sure many of you are members. If you're not members, we'd love to have you. Advertising slot over. Right. Here we go. Here's the economy on one slide. Almost all these slides I'm about to show you are from the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee report. Everyone is struggling to really make projections. Oops, sorry. And they're often really describing what they're saying as a scenario. Bank of England no different. This is it on one slide. I'll go through it in a bit more detail, but you can see here that first a big chart showing their expectations of what might happen to GDP, the top right hand corner suggesting what might happen to employment, and then the bottom right hand corner where we might go with inflation. I should warn you that this bit of the presentation is unlikely to cheer you up, but it might at least be useful. So let's just zoom in a little bit. So this chart is PMI, which is Purchase Manager Indexes. These are sort of these are really good measures of economic sentiment. Across the world, statisticians talk to some of the people who manage the order books for big companies, and they take a view about whether or not they like to be ordering more or less. You can see that for every index, those purchase managers are predicting a lot less activity as in the next few months. That's the impact of the virus rattling through on their business expectations. So let's come on at GDP. So this is a kind of a short-term view of GDP from the Bank of England's potential scenario. You can see a massive dip in the first 2 quarters of this year. And here is the slightly longer-term projection or scenario that the Bank of England are working with. There's that famous V that you hear people talking about. So the big debate here is, will the recession that we experience, will it be a V? Will it be a U? Will it be a bathtub? Will it be an L? That determines a huge amount of our future. This scenario looks at a kind of V-shaped scenario, a hugely significant reduction in the scale of our economy in the short term, but a gradual return across 2021, 22 to the trajectory that we were on. But don't believe my words, these are the BOE economists' words. GDP in Q2 2020, 30% lower than it was in 2019. Now, bear in mind, a recession is usually kind of 1-2% reduction in growth. That's absolutely enormous. But with a significant amount of recovery, so it may be that it's short and sharp, but it's going to be pretty painful, and that's what we need to prepare for. But trying to predict the future in an environment like this is incredibly difficult. So just to entertain you all, forecasting is complicated. I don't expect you to read all of that, but just look at that long list of assumptions that underpin even these scenarios that the BOE have produced, and then you just look at that kind of throwaway line right at the bottom. And of course, the illustrative scenario is conditioned on the assumption that the UK moves to a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU on the 1st of January 2021. So those numbers are all dependent on this long list of things happening. If they don't happen, the numbers look different. But I think all economists are agreed that there is going to be a very, very sharp shock in the short term. And the debate really is about the relative depth of that shock and the speed at which we recover. And clearly that conditions everything that goes on in the UK. These are really the same kind of numbers, just shown in a little bit more detail. You can see the degree to which employment spikes. And again, a relatively optimistic view, though, that employment might start to fall back to current levels relatively quickly as the economy picks up. Obviously, that would be a better outcome than a kind of inverted U, which is one of the other possibilities. Inflation drops quite dramatically, particularly driven by the oil price. I suppose a word of warning here for all of us: low inflation feels pretty good, doesn't it? Because we think of high inflation as being bad. We should just all be aware that the point at which inflation drops to zero or below zero, that's quite dangerous for an economy. You end up in a situation of deflationary economics, where if you sit on money, it becomes worth more over time, not less. What happens then is that companies and individuals start to defer expenditure, because why buy that new telly today when it'll be cheaper in 6 months' time? And you can get a demand stall, and you can end up in a kind of in a sort of circle, a spiral of decline. Japan spent a lot of the 90s and the 2000s trying to deal with that kind of problem. It's very hard to get out of. So I think for all of our well-being, I think we should hope that we don't actually see a negative CPI. It seems superficially attractive, but actually it's very dangerous. How much might all of this cost? That's one of the big debates at the moment, isn't it? What is it costing the Treasury to run the amount of interventions they're making in the economy? I think that the furlough scheme is costing in the region of £11-12 billion a month, about the same scale as the NHS. There's no way that that level of spending is simply being funded out of general taxation. In fact, in a period where economic activity declines in the way that we are looking at, tax revenues drop off a cliff as well. So it's broadly financed by borrowing. And what that chart that I've got there shows you, these are numbers put together by the Resolution Foundation using numbers from the OBR and others. That shows you the potential increase and spike in government borrowing relative to where we were expecting to go, based on a kind of 3-month interruption, a 6-month or a 12-month interruption. And you can see that even a 3-month kind of interruption, a 3-month government support pushes GDP debt as a proportion of GDP above 100%. There's nothing necessarily magical about it, but you will see for a lot of the 80s and 90s, 2000s, we were chugging along at less than 50%. At that point, our competitor economies in Europe were in the sort of 60 to 80% kind of category. After the financial crisis, our borrowing went up quite dramatically. We had been beginning to see that come down again, but you can see that in every scenario there, it spikes quite dramatically. And certainly if we have a 12-month significant interruption with high levels of government spending, we spike back to debt as a proportion of GDP more than 150%, so more than 150% of the size of the economy, really levels we've not seen since the early 1950s, when we were paying off war debt. Now, this is, for me, this is kind of Groundhog Day, because some of this stuff that I'm talking about now is what I spent a lot of time talking about in 2009, 2010, as we recovered from the financial crisis. And it's worth just being very clear in our own minds that there are two measures of debt that we need to be keeping an eye on. One is the total amount of debt, which is what this is showing you, if like the size of the mortgage. The other is the kind of yearly overdraft. What's the deficit that the government is running every year? That is scheduled, I think, to or forecast to rise to about 15% of GDP this year. Just for a comparison, at the height of the financial crisis, I think we hit about 11% of GDP. That was pretty much a high score across Europe, with the possible exception of Greece, and was quite painful. So these numbers are large, but probably at least as an important question is what does it cost us to deal with the cost of that debt? And this chart is very interesting. What this shows you is the debt interest payments that we would face as a country. You can see they've dropped dramatically over time. They've dropped dramatically for two reasons. First of which is that pile of government debt that I was talking about is much lower than it was in the 50s and 60s. Second, since before the financial crisis, but particularly afterwards, actually, interest rates have been incredibly low. The Bank of England base rate is now the lowest that it's been since the Bank of England was formed 319 years ago, I think. So actually, debt interest payments fall under every scenario, including that 12-month scenario, according to the analysis done by the Resolution Foundation. Now, not all economists would say that was as optimistic as a view of life as I might be presenting, but I think it's an interesting thing for us to reflect on. It probably doesn't create the sort of chaos that it might create in our kind of personal finances if we doubled our level of debt overnight. It is a challenge because tax revenues are dropping, but I think it shows you that the government has some room for manoeuvre here. At least I would contend that it shows you that. And what is everybody else spending? That's a question that's worth asking, isn't it? Actually, there are two very different interpretations of how much money the UK is likely to spend on the COVID response. One there from the OBR and one there from the IMF. I tend to suspect that the OBR might be right. They've probably seen more detail. Interestingly, we're a sort of mid-table performer there, costing us just shy of 6% of GDP. Not entirely unexpected, and actually our level of intervention is not as large as some of those other countries, especially when you consider that countries like Germany and France have probably got a relatively more generous welfare state than the UK, so they are already spending more. The Japanese intervention is massive, but as we discussed earlier on, they have been struggling with a semi-permanent case of deflationary economics. Also, Japan is a nation of savers. They buy their own government debt, which enables them to run far higher levels of government debt than lots of other economies. But we're kind of mid-table performers, so we're not kind of out of whack. I think that's interesting to know. How is the government doing? This is very recent polling from this last weekend, the approval ratings for their handling of the crisis. CIH is a politically neutral charity, so I need to be careful about what I say next, but I think if you were working in government, you probably wouldn't be delighted with those numbers. It's clear that the famous Sunday evening speech may not have quite hit the mark, and there's been quite a deterioration in the view of the government's handling of the crisis, and that will be causing them pressure. It's causing them pressure politically, but also in terms of the policy environment, in terms of bandwidth, in terms of the things they might be considering as the intervention thing they make next, probably also affecting the decisions they make on managing the move out of lockdown. So this chart is a bit busy, but it's just comparing how the UK government is seen relative to other governments across the world. If you look at that UK line, we're a mid-table performer dropping towards the relegation zone. That this data is slightly older than the data on the previous slide. Interesting as usual to see the Scandinavians towards the top of the list, quite happy with what their governments are doing. I don't want to play international stereotypes, but certainly France, I think, quite cross with their government, but possibly a semi-permanent state of affairs. USA on a steadily downward trajectory, and some really interesting so this is kind of international political observation. The countries that seem to be doing best here and are perceived as being doing best their own populations, that group is no longer dominated by the kind of G8, G20 developed economies. Look at Vietnam there, so, top of the list. My guess is if New Zealand was on this list, they'd be outperforming everybody. But that's just, it's quite interesting to see ourselves in a broader context. And what's it doing for Boris? Well, I think the answer is, this is being recorded, so I'll resist making a flippant observation about the career move going into hospital. But it seems to me that Boris is coming under a bit more pressure than he was. His approval ratings are following the government's approval ratings. Actually, they're moving downwards, and I think that shows you, I think probably as well as whatever kind of personal political observations you might make, the process of moving out of lockdown for governments looks a lot more difficult than the process of moving into it, and it creates a lot more challenges, and there are probably a lot more things to balance. And then on the other side of the equation, what's life look like for Keir? Well, in the sort of 50s and 60s, we used to talk about whether or not people had a good war or a bad war. At the moment, these numbers suggest he's having quite a good war. And you can see that he's very early on in his period as a leader of the opposition. But what's happening, or what seems to be happening, is his sort of disapproval ratings have leveled out a bit, but he's converting quite a lot of the don't knows to approving. So I think he's setting the government a different puzzle than the one that they were set by the Corbyn opposition. It's a different style, it's more loyally, it's slightly more forensic, it's powered by the data and by very, very careful questions. And at the moment, that seems to be changing our politics. I think, one level you'd be thinking, what has this got to do with housing? Well, at one level, absolutely nothing at all. But at another level, politics sets the weather. So it's just worth being aware of how our politics is panning out. But the government's got quite a lot of room for manoeuvre still. Those poll ratings are extraordinarily high by traditional standards. They've got a very, very large majority in the House of Commons. This is still a government that has enormous power, enormous ability to get stuff done. If they decide they want to do stuff, including doing stuff on housing, they can push stuff through, even in the face of a relatively resurgent opposition. So the political calculus maybe hasn't moved quite as much as those opinion ratings would tell you. I guess you could say you can see that very, very recent reduction in the government's poll ratings and increase in Labour's poll ratings. They do look to me to be quite similar to the approval ratings for the handling of the pandemic. So this looks to me to be one to watch. What about the housing market? Well, I don't think you'd be surprised given what I showed you about the economy overall. Both sales added and listings added to the Zoopla website just fell through the floor in the March period as we headed towards lockdown, and have broadly stayed there since. So the housing market is paused, and lenders in the purchase market are very cautious. You can see here they are restricting their business to lower loan to value products. You will all understand the degree to which affordability is already constrained. Deposits are hard for people to save. So certainly first time buyers, but lots of other buyers have got a high reliance on higher loan to value mortgages. That looks like the sort of for sale market is relatively closed to a lot of would-be purchasers, at least in the short term, probably in the medium term. I don't expect you to read all the words on this chart, and we'll circulate the slides afterwards, I think. But what this is showing you actually is that even during lockdown, there was a bit of a bounce back in the rental market. That's because you were still allowed to list rentals, and I think probably as you see pressure mounting in the for sale market, well, where are those households going to find a place to live? And people returning home or moving or looking to move location will be using the rental market. So actually it saw a little bit of a bounce in April, and that's interesting because that was still during lockdown. Not so for sales prices. I apologise, this is a very busy chart. All of this is from Zoopla, by the way, who published some really, really good data, but you can see overall that the for sale housing market, particularly look at that right hand chart there, comparing the blue line of 2019 with the orangey browny line of actual sales this year. We are way below previous sales figures, both in terms of prices and in terms of numbers of transactions, and bear in mind that transactions actually do drive house prices to a significant degree. There's a strong relationship there. So this is courtesy of Zoopla. These 3 bullet points are their summary. So there was some modest house price growth, but demand has really dropped right off a cliff, really, unprecedented reduction. Nearly more than 1/3 of sales held up, and probably sales overall only 50% of the levels that they were in 2020. So I think we can expect house prices to weaken, but maybe the rental market to show a bit more buoyancy than we had anticipated. And you will know that the affordable housing, the housing association, local authority sector increasingly plays in the private rental market and the home ownership market to deliver cross subsidy for social rent and for other rented tenures. So these numbers matter for affordable housing. Okay, just 3 or 4 slides on to what's going on in the policy environment, and rather than kind of rehearse a load of detail that I think you all know already, I thought it might be more useful to try to kind of spot some trends, really. So I'm trying to spot what survived the COVID pandemic, what hasn't survived, what's gone missing in action, what might the longer term picture be. These are the things that I think have broadly survived and still remain relevant. We know that the government is still trying to make progress on all of the issues around fire safety, on Hackett. The working groups still continue to do their work, and we know that as far as possible, landlords are still trying to do the critical fire safety work. And actually, as lockdown has slightly eased, where that work's involved doing work on the outside of buildings or on communal areas, I think people are increasingly going back to work. The government definitely still interested in housing supply. We know they promised a bigger affordable housing programme. I think that's probably still there. Timing, I think, is everything. I suspect these discussions will take place across the summer, maybe with some announcements in the autumn. Home ownership remains, I think, a focus of the government overall, but in particular a focus of the Secretary of State. Robert Jenrick is a traditional Conservative politician, a traditional Conservative Secretary of State, Housing Minister. All of his early announcements, all of his early thinking was about home ownership, interventions, the right to shared ownership, the First Homes proposed programme. He's still keen on the right to buy for housing associations. So that agenda hasn't gone away. And finally, I think, slightly quieter, but still there, I think that government knows that these long-term investment programmes need attention and they need continuity. We can't afford to lose ground. We've got work to do on safety, but also on stock condition and on sustainability. And we're already seeing quite a lot of debate about the degree to which the recovery from the pandemic will be a green recovery. I think this bit of housing is playing in those debates. Stuff that's emerged. I won't go through all of this list, but I draw your attention to a few things. So I'm sure in every one of your organisations, you've been thinking about how do we retain a service to our customers, what is core, what will we have to put into abeyance for the time being, how do we do it in a way that is safe. Those debates, I think, are happening at every level, including at government policy level. There's huge attention on homelessness and street homelessness in particular. What happens at the end of the Everybody In programme? How does government not lose the ground that has been made? That's an active area for debate, but I don't think I see any conclusions yet. Related to that, the work, I know that government are looking now at the private rented sector, the fact that we've had a moratorium on evictions, but that ends at the end of June. What policy intervention is going to be required in order to avoid a kind of a huge kind of landslide of eviction cases as soon as the restrictions are lifted? You'll have noticed that government is very, very concerned about domestic violence and interventions to deal with domestic violence. I think you will see more action in that space. They're very worried about the impact of lockdown for domestic violence, and then wanting to think now about how to intervene. And at the top there, gas safety, I think, was a really big issue early on. I think it's broadly been resolved now. Debates between the sector, the government, the regulators, gas safe and health and safety executive, I think, have concluded that everybody understands that access is more difficult, that staff sickness is more difficult, that supply chains are more difficult. But broadly, the expectation is you make the best efforts that you can to access a property and to do the work. If you're not able to, it's important that you record that you're not able to. And if you can demonstrate that wasn't possible, I think Gas Safe and HSE will look kindly on you. But I think there's a clear message that we can't just say, well, it's too hard, we can't do it. We have to try, and we have to document having tried. At the bottom there, I wanted to recognise there are threats to income clearly in the environment, greater unemployment, greater reliance on welfare benefits. But at this point, all of the monitoring that the regulator and others are doing is not showing up significant spikes in arrears or bad debts. So there's no policy action at this point in time, but it's being kept under review. It might be interesting to know how you and your individual organisations are getting on that. What's gone missing in action? A few things. We know the government wanted to do more on planning reform. I think all radical conservative governments always do want to do more on planning reform. Part of me isn't entirely disappointed. I think planning actually does quite well if it's left alone to settle for a while. But I think that debate will come back, but it's missing in action at the moment. I think regen is missing in action. And I think things on tenant and resident voice are much quieter than they were. But I think that will come back. Takes me to that middle point, rents policy, don't mention the war, would be my advice. My understanding is that actually, although the housing sector is very exercised about the potential for another rent cut, at least in the short term, I'm not really sure that's on the government's agenda. So maybe we don't want to put it on their agenda. It maybe is not the very large risk than we had thought. Now, that will be a prediction that comes back to haunt me, let's just be clear. But that's where the mood music seems to be at the moment. So finally on policy, where next? This is clearly by far the most uncertain part of what I'm talking to you about. But I think what I want to leave you with here is an impression that we might be at a moment of opportunity. People like me, people like CIH and others have been saying for the last 2 or 3 years that the settlement around housing is broken, the social contract doesn't work, it doesn't deliver for large parts of our population. Well, I think I would argue that the pandemic has probably made that completely apparent, hasn't it? We can see that those members of society that are probably the rest of us are relying on to see us through, to manage our way through the pandemic, to be the key workers, to be the people who keep stuff running when the rest of us are able to work from home or adjust how we work. Those are also the people who do least well out of that social economic settlement. They are insecure in housing and in employment. They have worse health outcomes. They are the lowest paid. They have the poorest housing conditions. We're asking them to take the biggest risk. They're getting sick in larger numbers, and sadly, they're dying in larger numbers. So, I think that there is at least a chance that in our public debate, we are approaching a kind of a 1918, a 1945 moment where, as a nation, we say, is this really the social settlement that we want to see? Is this the right social contract? You can see that already, I think, in some of the columns that are being written in various newspapers up and down the country, including extraordinarily in the FT, which I don't think you would have seen 15 years ago. Alongside that, I think it's highly likely, given those economic numbers we looked at earlier on, that some sort of government fiscal stimulus, government investing in the economy is likely, and that may probably across the summer debates about how that might look, where they'll invest, where they'll spend, will begin to take place. I'd suggest in both of those areas that we really should be thinking now about, so what is housing's role? What is social housing role in a new social contract? What should be our role in a fiscal stimulus? I'd suggest that we absolutely should be making the case for addressing access to decent housing, addressing affordability, addressing condition, addressing security, and addressing safety, all things that are missing for too many people at the moment. I think that means making the case for a big role for social and affordable housing, and especially for social rent. I think if we're not clear about the degree to which sustainability and carbon emissions must be part of the work we do in housing. I think we're missing a big trick. And I don't only mean there in terms of the new homes we build. I think we need to be looking very, very carefully at our existing stock. And I think this is where the tenant and resident voice debate will come back. I think this is not about doing stuff to people. This is about doing stuff with people and listening to what the people who will be living in those homes are telling us about what they want and what they need. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I also think professionalism should play a critical role in this. Actually, being professional is about not only knowing what is good, what is right, what the law says, what good services look like. It's also about the way in which you deal with people as individuals. It's about the behaviours that you show. It's about the fact that you engage in ethical decision making. It's about the fact that you don't just follow the rules blindly. You apply them to the situation you see in front of you. I think we could argue that quite a lot of the failures we've seen in our housing system have been where that hasn't happened. I think in the future we need to do better on those kind of measures. And my final point on this kind of future policy agenda would be that I think probably timing and presentation is everything. Trying to work out when to start these conversations, I think, is really tricky. It takes up a lot of time for people like me. My sense is the answer is soon but not yet. I think government is too deeply engaged still in the process of managing the impacts of the pandemic, managing the furlough program, getting on top of the finances, dealing with the immediate crises, things like the homelessness issues we talked about earlier on. But at some point, I suspect across the summer, they will lift their heads, and we need to be ready to play our part in those conversations to make a case for the role that housing can play in a new social contract. We need, I think, to find a way of talking about that is not technocratic, that is not just a sector talking to itself, but also engages public opinion. And I think we also need to understand that we may only get one chance. I think government won't do, or they will want to avoid at all costs, repeated fiscal stimulus packages. They will want to do one, get it done, get it big enough and get it fast enough that it has the impact that they want. If we want housing to be part of it, we have to get our timing right on that. So finally, what conclusions can we draw? I think it's unclear what the uncertainty is about, is what I think I'd like to say. It's quite hard to draw conclusions here, but I think there are some things that we can say without doubt. There will be an enormous economic impact. That economic impact will lay bare the failings of our housing system, the failings of our social contract. I would say we must do better, and that a post-COVID settlement should offer that chance. And even if politicians and governments don't want to play a role, I think we should be challenging ourselves about what we want to do about the fact that we can see that the pandemic has laid bare the limitations of our social model. I said to you that I'd start gloomily. I forgot to say that I'd end optimistically. I am quite optimistic about what we can achieve. If you think about your own experience, about your own organisation, think about the degree to which the pandemic has shown us what we can really do if we really need to. I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying that their organisation had harboured a long-term ambition to move to the ability to support completely remote working, and their IT team had thought that this was an 18-month to 2-year project. Well, they did it in 4 days when they needed to. So you think about the stuff that we've been able to change almost overnight. I think that we can be optimistic about what we can achieve if we set our minds to it. So I would say let's fix the damage that the pandemic has done, but let's keep the good and let's not lose the urgency. We have already done some incredible stuff, and the sense that we can do things and do things fast, I think, is what's going to be needed to get us through the medium-term environment that I've been talking about. And I'll stop there, Steve. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gavin. Well, I think that was a pretty comprehensive canter through just about everything. I'd remind our attendees to, if they've got any questions at all for Gavin here, who clearly has a brain the size of a planet, if you can get those questions to me using the Q&A function, Meanwhile, as they come in, I've got a couple of questions, Gavin, if I can.
Sure.
You flagged some themes that social housing providers can contribute to sort of going forward, such as access, affordability, broad policy areas in which the government might want to address, hopefully in some kind of new form of social contract. Have you got any policies up your sleeve that you think the government should be prioritising?
Well, that's a good question. So I think I've got kind of two answers to that. So there's some short-term stuff that we are looking at now, which are measures that we think are going to be necessary to kind of manage our way out of the kind of crisis management that we've been in. So I mentioned debates around street homelessness and if you like, not losing the progress that's been made by everybody in. We know there's huge limitations to that program, and we can't be relying on using kind of hotel accommodation in particular in the longer run. But there is a moment of opportunity there to think about what we might do to cement that progress. So we're thinking about that. I think there may be a moment of opportunity around domestic abuse and domestic violence, because there has been at least a small hiatus in lettings because of lockdown. That means there'll be a larger than normal number of homes that social landlords will now be looking to let again as we come out of lockdown. If we even manage to devote a small number of those homes to households moving on from hostel accommodation, we'll be able to create a space that's needed to house people who will be fleeing domestic violence that's occurred during lockdown. Now that's not straightforward, because we know that we're in other nomination agreements. There are other high pressure housing categories, but there's a debate that I think is worth having there. And we're also doing some thinking about, so what should a suite of policy measures that might help us to manage the gradual unravelling of the moratorium on evictions in the private sector look like? So that's kind of short-term stuff which I think we need to be thinking about. At one level, the longer-term stuff kind of sort of remains the same. The fundamental problems that we face in our housing market, now, I don't think they've changed as a result of the pandemic. They've just been laid bare. So for a long time, I've been saying, as CIH has been saying, we have to do better on the delivery of truly affordable housing. And that means more. It probably means more investment, and it means a different mix of investment. So our long-term position has been that government should be looking to fund an affordable housing program in England of about 135,000 homes a year, of which 90,000 homes should be social rented homes. I don't think the pandemic has changed the underlying demographics or the underlying economics very much at all. So we still need to be looking to a program of that scale in order to have the kind of impact and to make the difference that we need to make to deal with affordability, to deal with access, to deal with insecurity.
Okay. Right. Got a question come in from John Verge at Golden Lanes Housing. Yes, I think it's best I'll read this. It's a bit of a long one, and it does depend on whether you've seen the letter from Genric that popped up yesterday.
I've not seen it yet. I know about it, so I'm at a disadvantage.
Oh, right. I'll read it out. We'll see where we get to with it anyway. What John says is, we've seen some great cross-working between social landlords and good links with government. But did the CIH have sight of the letter from the Housing Minister published yesterday to all social tenants? It suggests tenants should expect non-urgent repairs and planned maintenance to restart now. Do you think this decision was more politically driven, with kickstarting the whole housing construction and repairs market, rather than the best timing for the safety of tenants and landlord staff? We're concerned about ensuring safety of our vulnerable tenants in supported housing and the sector's ability to respond with adequate PPE.
Yes, that is a good question. Right, let me try to answer that without moving into kind of a sort of diplomatic phraseology, which means it's impossible to interpret what I'm saying. Well, look, let's be honest. So the government is trying to walk, I think, a bit of a tightrope here. They're under pressure from every kind of constituency between health, safety, and other constituencies that want the economy restart very quickly. So I suspect that did play a role in the letter. I think that if I were advising the government, I would say I would be cautious about pushing too hard on that agenda, simply because I think that as a sector, we are still working our way through understanding what safe working practices look like in the variety of different environments in which we work. And I know also that supplies of PPE are difficult. They're difficult in different bits of the country. There's a bit of a regional picture to that, and actually that regional picture has moved around over time. It started out being particularly severe in London. The last I heard, the situation in London was improving, not fixed, but improving, but beginning to get worse in other bits of the country. So I think a sort of seamless move back to where we were before the lockdown seems to me to be a bit optimistic. I think it will be gradual. I think, as I said in my remarks, what I'm hearing is that landlords are starting finding it more easy to start with work on the outside of buildings and in communal areas. I think other bits of work, particularly internal work, particularly kitchens and bathrooms and enclosed spaces, looks more difficult. So I think there's a degree of optimism in the letter. I can understand the optimism, and I think we all want to provide good quality services to tenants and residents as soon as possible, but it's not going to be straightforward. As landlords, your employers, you have a duty of care for the safety of your workers and your employees, and I wouldn't advocate doing anything other than looking at that very carefully. If that means that in the short term some work is difficult or impossible to carry out, then I still think that's the right answer, because otherwise we're taking risks for people's health. And you don't need me to remind you, the whole point about being safe around health is not only just about our individual health, but it's also about the degree to which we will then pass on the virus to those people who are more at risk. So I think that letter sounds like it's at the optimistic end of the spectrum.
And what do you think his motivation was?
Well, I think the motivation probably was what I tried to say, which is the government clearly are trying to balance themselves between those different constituencies, showing those constituencies who are most interested in health that they're taking that seriously, but also responding to the pressure from business, from backbenchers and elsewhere, to get the economy moving. I'm sure that played a part in what the minister wrote. Whatever they do have an unenviable balancing act, don't they? We should recognise that. But I think I would still probably be urging caution, because the practicalities of doing some kinds of work look to me to be quite involved, and we want to develop good, safe working practices. I should be very clear that I think where emergency work and particularly safety work is required, we have to find a way of doing it. But he's not just talking about that in his letter, he's talking about all work.
Okay, thanks. Denis Reichle is saying, you mentioned that the government is still keen to pursue the right to buy for housing association tenants. How does this impact now, when affordability is even more challenging and when future supply to meet enormous demand is even greater?
Well, I think the impact is the kind of the same as it ever was, in the sense that affordability is very, very stretched. So it isn't always clear the amount of purchase, if you like, that a right to buy scheme for housing association tenants would get. It certainly wouldn't be the level of purchase that the original right to buy scheme in the local authority sector had when it was introduced in 1979. The demographics in the social housing sector were completely different then. The income distribution, the employment figures, everything very, very different. The impact would be, I think, very unfortunate. Some of you would have noticed that over a long period of time now, we've been publishing our estimates of the losses of social rented housing. The last time we updated them, I think our estimate of the 2012 to 2020 losses of social rented homes was 199,000 homes. And a decent chunk of those losses were through the right to buy. So we've been calling for the right to buy to be suspended in England. It's already abolished in Scotland and Wales, because we think that now is not the time to be running a large discounted sales program. But the right to buy for some parts of the Conservative Party is a kind of pillar of faith, really, and regarded kind of uncritically as always good. And so I think the enthusiasm remains undiminished. Personally, I don't think it's a good policy choice. I think it's quite a legitimate policy choice for government to say we want to assist people, including social housing tenants, into home ownership, and we intend to use some government investment to do that. Perfectly legitimate object of government policy. I think heavily discounted sales of the existing stock under a programme like Right to Buy don't look to me to be the right policy solution. But let's just say that I'm pretty clear the government doesn't agree with me on that.
Right. And might just pick up Rachel Fullwood's. She's up in Stoke. It picks up on this as well. She's saying that they've identified that there's significant shortage of affordable social housing, as we know, sort of as a means of mitigating right to acquire disposal losses. Do you feel the government might now be in a position to put a floor on these kind of disposals, on right to acquire?
I think it's unlikely. I think the government overall is a fairly kind of, in this sense, maybe in this sense only, a fairly traditional Conservative government where they value programmes that support home ownership. And Robert Jenrick in particular, I think, takes a very strong view that he prefers home ownership as an outcome. You can see that in all of the early policy announcements that he made. There was a very interesting line around first home when people like CIH said, well, we're very concerned about this as a proposal because we think it runs the risk of undermining Section 106, which is the delivery mechanism for about half of all current social and affordable housing supply in England. To which the answer came back from the civil service machine: the minister has made a conscious choice. So I think we do have a government that by its nature is very, very interested in home ownership, and a Secretary of State who is particularly interested in it. I think it's very unlikely that they will take steps to reduce the scale of existing home ownership programmes that we have. As you know from what I've already said, I wouldn't agree with that. I think in particular, sales of existing stock in particular, I think are problematic. We at CIH, we've said that they should be suspended while we try to get back on top of the housing supply problem. Government doesn't agree with us.
Okay. And David Chafee down in Brighton, he's saying Housing First seems to be gaining some traction in government. What's the CIH's position on this?
This is Housing First as a mechanism for dealing with homelessness. So I'm not an expert, but I think it has gained traction. I know it's not the whole answer. We've been optimistic about the impact that it has had. It's an interesting example of kind of international learning. I think there's we've been supportive of it as a policy choice. It looks to have potential, but like all individual measures, policy wonks like me say they need to be part of a kind of broader, joined up approach to dealing with the systemic failings in our housing system. So Housing First absolutely is predicated on people being able to get the support that they need. That asks questions about things like social care and funding for what was supporting people. And overall, large parts of our housing problem, including homelessness and street homelessness, are actually driven by a lack of affordability and a lack of adequate supply. So I think it looks to me, and I think to my colleagues in CIH who are homelessness experts, to have been a very welcome initiative that's had quite a lot of success. But you need to see it as part of a broader program of measures. I think regarding any of the kind of programs we've talked about today as solutions in and of themselves, which I know is not what was being suggested by the question, but we can't regard these things as operating in isolation. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. And Mark Jackson down in Lambeth is saying, given MPs' support yesterday for the immigration bill and the impact that this will have on the recruitment of key workers, what can the CIH do to help the care sector?
Oh, that's a very good question. So some of that is kind of beyond my expertise. What we can certainly do is, in as far as housing and care kind of interacts, we try to be a place where professionals can come together and share practice. We try to be a place where actually we kind of collate and then disseminate good practice. So I know that one of the debates that's taking place at the moment, for instance, is about what is the kind of best and most effective kind of cleaning regimes that we should be applying for shared support accommodation, hostel accommodation, and others. I think at the margins we can help with that kind of stuff. Some of the bigger problems that beset the care system, it seems to me at least, are to do with the kind of policy framework and the funding framework. We, like everybody else, would say this needs urgent attention and it needs to be addressed. But that's in the final analysis, that's an issue for government. It's a resourcing issue. We would agree and make the case for a better settlement for care. We would also do, and we do what we can to encourage professionals to join up across housing and health and housing and care, because I think the greater the degree of coordination, of information exchange, of understanding, the better the outcomes. But my understanding is at the heart of our social care challenge is a bit of a policy challenge and a funding challenge, and that needs government action to address.
Okay, and just whilst we're on issues of practice, John Delahunty down at Innisfree is saying, given our experience of being able to work remotely, we'll never go back to the same pattern. And so now we're thinking about our future operating model. Will the CIH have an offer to support professional practice in that new world order?
I'm going to make a big claim and say yes. So, hi John, by the way. I haven't seen you in ages. So a few things to say. So I think John is right. I don't think we will simply go back to working as we were. It's one of the things I tried to suggest in my presentation, that whether or not you can call it good to have come out of the pandemic, but we have made some changes as a result of the situation the pandemic forced upon us, which I think we probably won't want to undo. Because we've seen that they're beneficial. They've given us the ability to do our work better or with greater flexibility, and we want to keep them. And I think one of those areas is probably it's changed our view of our operating model, about how we think about our offices, about maybe being able to work in a more agile way. I was very taken by something that I saw on one of the kind of video logs that the Disruptive Innovators Network published, where they were Ian Wright was interviewing a woman who works in BT's kind of innovation operation, and she was saying that she didn't think that the pandemic would see the end of offices. She thought that was overstated, but she said it will definitely change what we use offices for. And she also said that in her hope was that it would help us to have greater clarity about what offices are actually for. And she went on to say that in her view, offices are platforms for collaboration. So these are my words, not hers. So I think the way that I interpreted that would be to say to my colleagues, so if you're planning on coming in the office to spend all day staring at a spreadsheet, to not talk to anybody, to maybe ring a couple of your suppliers and then go home again, I wouldn't bother coming in if I were you. You can work from home and do all of that. But if you are needing to come into the office to discuss with your colleagues how we're going to change something, innovate something, take something forward, develop something new, that's a good reason for coming in the office and using the office as a platform of collaboration. Will CIH support these new ways of working? Yes, I think we will, because the work that we are doing on trying to develop or the beginnings of a professional standards framework for housing is talking about not just defining housing professionals by kind of what we know, but also defining us by a set of behaviours, including a set of behaviours that are around being open to change, to challenge, to innovation, to adopt new ways of working, to not be obstructive. So as much as anything, I think some of this is going to be an attitude of mind. What the pandemic has done, I think for all of us, is it's probably made us engage quicker, earlier, and probably to a greater degree with kind of ideas that we were maybe a bit nervous about, that we were sort of pussyfooting around. And I think I said right at the end, didn't I, that I think it's delivered a sense of urgency that I don't want us to lose. And certainly I would hope, that one of the roles that we can play at CIH is to say, this urgency, this ability and this openness to exploring new and being flexible and looking for new and different ways to do things, that's something we'd want to see maintained. The other thing that I would say is we want to capture innovation that's happened during this period, the degree to which people have changed the way in which they're working. We're also partnering on a number of research projects that are happening in academia, looking to understand how housing organisations and others have responded to the pandemic. All of that is with an aim to capturing new practice, capturing changes, capturing innovation. And one of the functions of a professional body is to be a platform for sharing knowledge, sharing practice, sharing innovation. And I definitely want us to be doing that too.
That's fantastic, because I think you've inadvertently just managed to mop up the remaining questions, because I think Helen Barber's kind of making a comment on the Brave New World about perhaps the CIH coming up with training, practice, professional development around ethics, values and culture in a potentially home working environment. And also Hone down in London was also interested in what kind of lessons the sector can learn from this, like the sector's greatest hits, if you like, of good practice, which is just the work that you're referring to.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, probably too early to say exactly what they are, but we want to learn those lessons, and we've been engaging quite widely. We have an outline of what we think the professional standards framework for housing should look like, which I'll be happy to share with you and your members. Unfortunately for us, one of the bits of work we've had to slow down as a result of the financial impact on CIH of the pandemic has been work we were doing to build an IT platform which would house that standards framework and make it easy for people to access and think about their own personal training and development. We will do it. We'll just have to do it later than we had otherwise planned, simply because we have to manage the costs that we're incurring this year. But yeah, I believe that standards framework will help to underpin all of those kind of behaviours and all that sense of being a professional is about ethical decision making as well as simply knowing what the law says. That's the central part of what that framework says. Yeah,
well, that's brilliant. We're up to our appointed time. I'm sure you've probably got lots of stuff that you need to be getting on with, more Zoom meetings.
My next meeting has started, I can see.
Oh, right, okay. Well, that'll be my rubbish chairing. Sorry about that, Gavin. But no, I think that was really how it was a brilliant and comprehensive and clear, no points of clarification required. It was a brilliant canter through absolutely everything, and we've cracked on through everybody's questions. So it just remains for me to say thanks so much for doing this, and we'd really like you to come back another day and tell us everything that you seem to know. You just seem to be across so much stuff. I'd also like to thank all our attendees. We've only got one more of these at the moment, but we're hoping to bring some more on stream over the next few weeks. So if you haven't signed on for the next one, which is all about community investment on Thursday, please do so. You'll find it on our website. So Gavin, once again, thanks so much for your time and effort. It was brilliant, and bye-bye everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye everyone.